Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The growing argument, objects change size over time. A child grows into an adult, a sapling becomes a tree, a pebble is worn smooth by erosion, and yet we say these are the same entities, the same person, the same tree, the same stone. But if size and shape change, can identity truly remain? And this is the growing argument, sometimes called the growing block paradox, or the problem of material constitution. A puzzle about how objects can gain or lose parts while remaining numerically identical to themselves. Consider a statue made of clay, and a sculptor adds more clay to it, making it larger, and then removes some clay, making it smaller. And at each moment, the statue is made of different material, occupying a different volume, and yet we call it the same statue throughout the process. But if the statue is identical to the lump of clay that constitutes it, then the statue and the clay should share all their properties. Yet the statue has properties the clay does not. The statue has aesthetic value. The statue was created at a certain time. The statue could survive minor alterations, while the clay, as a mere lump, has none of these properties. And so the statue and the clay cannot be identical, even though they occupy the same space and are made of the same material. The paradox deepens when we consider the career of the clay. The lump existed before the statue was formed, and will exist after the statue is destroyed, and so the lump and the statue have different temporal boundaries. They begin and end at different times, and if they are not identical, then there must be two objects occupying the same space at the same time, the lump and the statue. And this seems strange, an unnecessary multiplication of entities. Some philosophers embrace this conclusion, arguing that the world contains far more objects than we ordinarily recognize, that every statue is accompanied by a lump, every organism by a mass of cells, every table by a quantity of wood, and that identity is highly context-sensitive, determined by how we carve up the world conceptually, rather than by objective metaphysical facts. Others reject this view, arguing that the statue and the lump are the same object considered under different descriptions, that the properties that seem different are not intrinsic properties but extrinsic or relational ones, that being a statue is a matter of how the lump is shaped and how it is regarded rather than being a separate object. The growing argument also applies to living organisms. Because a person gains and loses atoms constantly, the body grows from infancy to adulthood, shrinks in old age, yet personal identity persists. And the question arises whether the person is identical to the collection of matter that makes up their body at any given moment. And if not, then what are they? And if so, then how can they survive the replacement of that matter over time? Mereology, the study of parts and wholes, offers various theories to address these puzzles. Some argue that objects are identical if they share all the same parts at the same time, while others allow for gradual replacement, saying that identity can be maintained as long as the changes are continuous and not too drastic. And still others embrace temporal parts, arguing that objects are four-dimensional, with different temporal slices, and that the question of identity over time is really a question of whether those slices are connected in the right way. The growing argument forces confrontation with the question of what objects are, whether they are material lumps, patterns, processes, or conventional designations, whether identity is absolute or relative, whether the world contains discrete, persistent entities, or only a flux of matter temporarily arranged in stable configurations, and whether our language and concepts, which treat objects as enduring individuals, accurately reflect the structure of reality or impose a simplifying grid on something far more fluid and complex. The paradox remains unresolved, a source of ongoing debate in metaphysics, and it reminds us that growth and change, the most ordinary features of existence, conceal profound mysteries about identity, persistence, and the nature of the things that populate our world. The grandfather paradox. Time travel has long been a staple of science fiction, a dream of visiting the past or glimpsing the future. But woven into this fantasy is a logical nightmare that has haunted physicists and philosophers alike. And this is the grandfather paradox, a thought experiment that questions whether travelling backward in time could ever be possible without creating contradictions that tear reality apart. Imagine a person who builds a time machine and travels back to a point before their own birth, and while in the past this person encounters their grandfather as a young man, before he has met the traveller's grandmother, before any children have been conceived, and in a moment of recklessness or malice or accident, the time traveller kills their grandfather. The question that follows is immediate and devastating. If the grandfather dies before fathering any children, then the time traveller's parent is never born. And if the parent is never born, then the time traveller is never born. And if the time traveller is never born, then no one travels back in time to kill the grandfather, which means the grandfather lives, which means the parent is born, which means the time traveller is born, which means someone does travel back in time to kill the grandfather, and the loop closes, a perfect circle of cause and effect that devours itself. The paradox suggests that backward time travel, if possible, would permit changes to the past that erase their own causes, creating logical contradictions that seem to violate the basic structure of causality, the idea that causes precede effects, that events unfold in a coherent sequence rather than collapsing into impossible tangles. Some physicists argue that the paradox proves time travel to the past is impossible, that the laws of physics must somehow prevent any action that would create a causal loop or alter history in a way that leads to contradiction. And this idea is formalized in the Novikov self-consistency principle, which states that if time travel is possible, then only self-consistent timelines can occur, meaning the time traveler would find themselves unable to kill their grandfather. No matter how hard they tried, the gun would jam, the traveler would hesitate, something would always intervene to preserve consistency. Others propose the many worlds interpretation, suggesting that when the time traveler kills their grandfather, they create a branching timeline, a parallel universe where the grandfather dies and the traveler is never born in that branch, while in the original timeline, everything continues as before. And so no true paradox arises because the timelines never contradict each other. They simply diverge. Still others embrace the idea that time is not a single linear path, but a more complex structure, a block universe where past, present, and future all exist simultaneously, and where time travel is simply movement through a fixed four-dimensional landscape. And in such a universe, the grandfather was always killed by the time traveler. The timeline was always that way. There is no changing of history because history is immutable. All events, including the time travel, are already written into the fabric of space-time. The paradox also raises questions about identity and causation, about what it means to exist, about whether effects can precede their causes, and whether the universe permits contradictions or whether reality itself enforces logical consistency as a fundamental law. The grandfather paradox remains one of the most vivid illustrations of the conceptual challenges posed by backward causation, a puzzle that blends physics with metaphysics, science with philosophy, and that forces anyone dreaming of time travel to confront the possibility that the past, once written, cannot be rewritten without unravelling the very threads that make existence coherent. The Grelling-Nelson paradox. Words can describe themselves or they cannot, and this seemingly innocent observation becomes a doorway into paradox when Kurt Grelling and Leonard Nelson posed a question in 1908 that has troubled philosophers of language ever since. Some words are autological, meaning they possess the property they describe. The word short is short. The word English is English. The word polysyllabic is polysyllabic. And these words refer to themselves in a way that feels consistent and unproblematic. Other words are heterological, meaning they do not possess the property they describe. The word long is not long. The word German is not German. The word monosyllabic is not monosyllabic. And again, this seems straightforward. A simple division between words that apply to themselves and words that do not. The paradox emerges when the question is asked, is the word heterological itself heterological? And the mind stumbles immediately into the same kind of self-referential trap that haunts the liar paradox and Russell's paradox. If heterological is heterological, then it does not describe itself, which means it must be autological. But if it is autological, then it does describe itself, which means it must be heterological. And the loop spins without resolution, each answer immediately negating itself. This is not merely a trick of language, but a genuine problem for anyone attempting to build a theory of meaning or reference, because it suggests that not all predicates can be safely applied to themselves, that self-reference introduces instability into linguistic systems. Some philosophers argue that heterological is simply a defective predicate, a word that fails to have a coherent meaning because its definition leads to contradiction. Much like dividing by zero produces an undefined result in mathematics. Others suggest that the paradox reveals the difference between the use of a word and its mention, that when we ask whether heterological is heterological, we are confusing the word as an object with the word as a concept, and this confusion generates the paradox. Alfred Tarski proposed that language operates on different levels, with a meta-language used to talk about an object language, and that paradoxes like Grelling-Nelson arise when these levels are improperly mixed, when language tries to fully describe itself from within rather than from a higher vantage point. The paradox also connects to broader issues in semantics and the philosophy of language, questions about how words acquire meaning, whether meaning is fixed or context-dependent, and what it means for a word to refer to itself. If even simple adjectives can generate contradictions through self-reference, then the project of creating a complete and consistent theory of language may be impossible, or at least far more complicated than it first appears. The Grelling-Nelson paradox lingers at the edges of linguistic theory, a small question with large implications, a reminder that words are not just labels for things, but slippery tools that can twist back on themselves in unexpected ways, and that the quest to understand meaning must navigate carefully around the traps that self-reference sets. The EPR paradox, when particles know what their partners are doing. Two particles are created together in a quantum process, perhaps two photons emitted from a single atom, or two electrons produced in a pair, and these particles fly apart in opposite directions, travelling far from each other, perhaps to opposite ends of a laboratory, or even to different planets, and quantum mechanics predicts that these particles remain connected, entangled, in a way that defies classical intuition, because measuring a property of one particle instantly affects the other particle, no matter how far apart they are, and the measurement outcomes are correlated in ways that cannot be explained by assuming each particle carried definite properties from the beginning. And this is the EPR paradox, named after Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, who presented it in 1935 as an argument that quantum mechanics is incomplete, that there must be hidden variables, additional information not captured by the quantum wave function that determines the outcomes of measurements and explains the correlations without requiring instantaneous action at a distance. Imagine the scenario more concretely. Two particles are entangled such that they have opposite spins. If one is measured to have spin up, then the other will definitely be measured to have spin down, and vice versa. And this correlation is perfect, 100%, whenever both particles are measured along the same axis. And before measurement, quantum mechanics describes each particle as being in a superposition of spin up and spin down, neither definite, and the two particles together are described by an entangled state that cannot be factored into separate descriptions of each particle. The state is inherently joint, and when one particle is measured and found to be spin up, the other particle's state immediately becomes spin down, even if the two particles are light years apart. And this instantaneous correlation troubled Einstein, who called it spooky action at a distance, and argued that it violated the principle of locality, the idea that physical influences cannot travel faster than light, that distant events cannot have immediate effects. Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen proposed that quantum mechanics is incomplete, that each particle must carry hidden information, hidden variables that determine what the measurement outcomes will be, and these hidden variables are fixed at the moment the particles are created. And so when the particles are measured later, the outcomes are determined by these pre-existing properties, not by any instantaneous influence. And the correlation between the particles is explained by the fact that they started with correlated hidden variables, like two coins that were both set to heads when they left your hand and remain heads as they fly through the air. And when you look at them later, you find them both showing heads. And this correlation does not require any spooky action, just common initial conditions. And EPR argued that quantum mechanics, which does not include these hidden variables, gives an incomplete description of reality. For decades, the EPR argument was a philosophical debate, a question about interpretation and the nature of quantum mechanics. But in 1964, physicist John Bell proved a theorem that transformed the debate into an experimental question. Bell showed that any theory based on local hidden variables, any theory where measurement outcomes are determined by pre-existing properties and where influences travel at or below the speed of light, must satisfy certain mathematical inequalities, now called Bell inequalities, and these inequalities place limits on how strongly the measurement outcomes of two distant particles can be correlated. And Bell showed that quantum mechanics predicts correlations that violate these inequalities, that quantum correlations are stronger than any local hidden variable theory can produce. And so by performing experiments and measuring the correlations, one can test whether nature obeys the Bell inequalities, and if the inequalities are violated, then local hidden variables are ruled out, and quantum mechanics, with its spooky action at a distance, is vindicated. Experiments have been performed many times with increasing sophistication and precision, closing various loopholes, and the results consistently show violations of Bell inequalities, strong correlations that match quantum mechanical predictions, and rule out local hidden variable theories. And so nature does not obey locality in the way Einstein wanted. The particles really are entangled, and measuring one really does instantaneously affect the other. And this is now an established experimental fact, one of the most thoroughly tested predictions in physics, and the EPR paradox has been resolved in favour of quantum mechanics against Einstein's intuitions, though the philosophical implications remain deeply puzzling. The paradox forces a choice between giving up locality or giving up realism, the idea that physical properties have definite values independent of measurement, and most interpretations of quantum mechanics give up realism, accepting that particles do not have definite spin values until measured, that the spin only becomes definite through the act of measurement, and the entanglement means that the two particles are not independent. They form a single quantum system even when separated by vast distances, and measuring one particle provides information about the system as a whole, and this information is reflected in the state of the other particle. But this does not allow faster-than-light communication, because the measurement outcomes are random. Neither particle can control what value it will be measured to have, and so no message can be sent. Only correlations can be observed after the fact by comparing measurement records. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics, like Bohmian mechanics, preserve realism by giving up locality. introducing non-local hidden variables that allow instantaneous influences, pilot waves, that guide particles in ways that depend on the entire configuration of the universe. And these theories reproduce the predictions of quantum mechanics and are empirically equivalent, but they are non-local. They violate Einstein's principle that influences cannot propagate faster than light. And most physicists find this cost too high, prefer to accept that realism must be given up, that particles do not have definite properties until measured. Visualize the two entangled particles flying apart, one heading left and one heading right, and they are described by a single wave function, an entangled state that says, if left is up, then right is down, and if left is down, then right is up, but neither is definite until measured. And now imagine measuring the left particle and finding it spin up, and at that instant, even though the right particle is far away, its state changes. It becomes definitely spin down, and if someone measures the right particle immediately after, they will definitely find spin down. And this correlation holds no matter how far apart the particles are, no matter how quickly the measurements are performed, as long as they are performed along the same axis. And this instantaneous correlation cannot be explained by assuming the particles carry definite spins from the beginning. Bell's theorem proves that, and so the correlation is genuinely quantum, genuinely non-local, genuinely spooky. And yet it does not allow signaling, does not allow information to be sent faster than light, because the outcomes are random and cannot be controlled. The EPR paradox stands as one of the deepest puzzles in quantum mechanics, a paradox that led to Bell's theorem, to decades of experimental tests, to the confirmation of quantum non-locality, and to ongoing debates about what quantum mechanics means, about whether reality is fundamentally non-local, about whether measurement is a special process or an ordinary interaction, about whether consciousness plays a role, about whether the universe splits into branches or whether hidden variables exist beyond our current theories, and none of these questions has a settled answer. Different physicists and philosophers hold different views, and the EPR paradox remains a touchstone, a thought experiment that crystallizes the central mysteries of quantum theory. And Einstein's discomfort with spooky action at a distance, his belief that quantum mechanics must be incomplete, has been answered by experiment. Nature really is spooky. Particles really are entangled. Measurements really do have instantaneous non-local effects. And this is not a failure of the theory, but a feature of reality, a feature that defies classical intuition and forces us to accept that the quantum world operates according to rules that seem impossible, that violate locality, that create correlations stronger than any classical mechanism can produce. And the paradox endures, not as an unsolved problem, but as a solved problem with an unsettling answer. And the particles fly apart, entangled forever, connected by invisible quantum threads, and measuring one affects the other instantly, across any distance, and the universe is non-local. And the EPR paradox, intended to show that quantum mechanics is incomplete, instead revealed that nature is stranger than Einstein imagined. The Ellsberg paradox. An urn contains 90 balls, 30 of which are red, and 60 of which are some mix of black and yellow, but the exact proportions of black and yellow are unknown. The 60 non-red balls could be all black, all yellow, or any combination, and you are offered a series of bets, and the choices you face reveal a pattern of preferences that violates the standard axioms of rational decision theory. And this is the Ellsberg paradox, named after Daniel Ellsberg, who presented it in 1961. And the paradox demonstrates that people systematically prefer known probabilities to unknown probabilities, exhibiting what is called ambiguity aversion, a tendency to avoid situations where the probabilities are uncertain. And this preference pattern cannot be accommodated by expected utility theory, which requires that rational agents have well-defined subjective probabilities for all events and choose actions that maximize expected utility, calculated using these probabilities. The first bet involves choosing between two options, Bet A pays if a red ball is drawn, and Bet B pays if a black ball is drawn. And most people prefer Bet A, preferring to bet on red, where the probability is known to be 30 out of 90, 1/3, rather than betting on black, where the probability is unknown, could be anything from 0 to 60 out of 90. And this preference seems reasonable, seems to reflect a cautious attitude toward uncertainty, a desire to avoid ambiguity. The second bet offers a choice between Bet C, which pays if a red or yellow ball is drawn, and Bet D, which pays if a black or yellow ball is drawn, and most people prefer Bet D, preferring to bet on black or yellow, where the combined probability is known to be 60 out of 90, 2/3, rather than betting on red or yellow, where the probability depends on the unknown proportion of yellow balls. The paradox emerges when these two preferences are combined, because preferring Bet A to Bet B suggests that the person believes red is more likely than black, that they implicitly assign a higher subjective probability to red, and preferring Bet D to Bet C suggests that they believe black or yellow is more likely than red or yellow, which implies that black is more likely than red. And these two beliefs are contradictory. If red is more likely than black, then red or yellow should be more likely than black or yellow, given that both involve adding the same unknown proportion of yellow. And so the preference pattern violates the sure thing principle, the axiom that if you prefer X to Y when some event E occurs, and you also prefer X to Y when E does not occur, then you should prefer X to Y unconditionally, regardless of whether you know whether E occurred. The Ellsberg paradox cannot be explained by standard subjective probability theory, because any consistent assignment of subjective probabilities to red, black, and yellow would make the preference for A over B incompatible with the preference for D over C. And so the pattern reveals that people do not have well-defined subjective probabilities for ambiguous events, or that they do not maximize expected utility using those probabilities, and instead they exhibit a preference for known over unknown probabilities, a violation of the completeness axiom of decision theory, which requires that agents must be able to compare all options and have a preference or be indifferent between them. Ellsberg's paradox has inspired alternative decision theories that can accommodate ambiguity aversion, including maximum expected utility theory, where agents consider multiple possible probability distributions consistent with their knowledge and choose the action that maximizes expected utility under the worst-case distribution, effectively being pessimistic about ambiguity, and Choquet expected utility theory, where probabilities are replaced with capacities that need not be additive, allowing for a richer representation of uncertainty, and multiple priors models, where agents maintain a set of probability distributions rather than a single prior, and use decision rules that reflect their attitudes toward this multiplicity. The paradox also connects to debates about rationality and the normative status of decision-theoretic axioms. Some argue that the Ellsberg preferences are irrational, that they reflect cognitive biases or errors in reasoning, and that ideal rational agents would not exhibit ambiguity aversion, would assign consistent subjective probabilities and maximize expected utility, while others argue that ambiguity aversion is perfectly rational, that it reflects a reasonable response to ignorance, that known risks are genuinely different from unknown risks, and that the axioms of expected utility theory, while mathematically elegant, do not capture all aspects of rational decision-making. The paradox has practical implications for economics and finance, because ambiguity aversion affects how people make decisions under uncertainty, how they invest in markets where probabilities are unknown, how they value insurance and options, how they respond to new technologies with uncertain risks. And understanding ambiguity aversion helps explain behaviors that seem puzzling from a standard expected utility perspective, such as the home bias in portfolio choice, where investors prefer domestic assets over foreign assets, even when expected returns are higher abroad, and the equity premium puzzle, where the observed returns on stocks are much higher than on bonds, suggesting that investors demand large premiums for bearing ambiguous risks. The urn sits on the table, 90 balls inside, 30 red and 60 mixed, and you must choose, and the choices seem reasonable, seem to reflect a natural caution about the unknown, but the pattern of choices violates the axioms of rational decision theory, reveals a preference structure that cannot be represented by subjective probabilities, and the paradox forces a choice: either accept that the preferences are irrational and should be corrected, or accept that the theory is incomplete and should be extended, and neither option is comfortable. Neither satisfies the desire for a simple unified theory of rational choice. And so the Ellsberg paradox remains, a challenge to orthodoxy, a puzzle that resists easy resolution, a demonstration that human decision-making is more complex than the elegant mathematics of expected utility suggests, and the ambiguity persists. The unknown proportions of black and yellow remain unknown, and we choose as we must, preferring the known to the unknown, preferring certainty to ambiguity, and the theory struggles to accommodate this preference, struggles to explain why it should be rational or how it can be consistent, and the paradox endures, unsolved, unresolved, a permanent thorn in the side of decision theory. A reminder that rationality is contested, that formal models capture some aspects of decision-making but not all, and that the gap between theory and behaviour, between what axioms demand and what people do, may reflect not irrationality, but the inadequacy of the axioms themselves. And the urn waits, the balls wait, the choice waits, and we must decide, knowing some probabilities but not others. And the decision reveals something about us, about how we value knowledge and fear ignorance, about whether ambiguity is just another form of risk or something fundamentally different. And the paradox lingers, unresolved, unsettled, a puzzle that decision theory has not yet tamed. The inverted spectrum problem. What if your red looks like my blue? Two people stand before a ripe tomato, and both say the tomato is red. Both use the word correctly. Both learned colour terms in the same way, by being shown red objects and hearing the word red, and their colour vision is normal. Their eyes and brains function identically, and yet the question arises, do they see the same colour? Does the tomato produce the same subjective experience in both? Or could it be that what one person experiences as red, the other experiences as blue? That their colour experiences are inverted, their spectrums reversed, and yet because they learned language the same way, because red things produce the same relative patterns, they both call the same things red, and have no way of discovering that their experiences differ. And this is the inverted spectrum problem, a thought experiment that has troubled philosophers since Locke, a puzzle about whether subjective experiences are private, whether they could differ between people in ways that behavioural and physical evidence cannot detect, and whether such differences would matter, whether they would mean anything if they are undetectable in principle. Imagine spectrum inversion more precisely. Person A sees red things as having the experience that person B has when seeing blue things, and person A sees blue things as having the experience person B has when seeing red, and this inversion is systematic, extends across the entire spectrum. Green is inverted with purple, orange with indigo, and so on. And both people learned colour words by associating them with the experiences they actually have. So person A learned to call things red that produce the blue experience, and person B learned to call things red that produce the red experience, and their language use is identical, their behaviour indistinguishable, and the inversion is undetectable from the outside, cannot be discovered through any behavioural test, through any physical measurement, through any scientific investigation, because all the objective facts are the same, only the subjective experiences differ. The inverted spectrum problem raises questions about the privacy of qualia, about whether subjective experiences are essentially first personal, accessible only to the person having them, and if spectrum inversion is possible, then qualia are private, are not reducible to anything public or objective, because two people with inverted spectrums have different qualia despite having identical physical states and identical behaviours. And this challenges functionalism, challenges the view that mental states are defined by their functional roles, by their patterns of causes and effects, because inverted spectrums have the same functional roles but different experiential qualities, and so functional role does not determine qualia, does not exhaust the nature of conscious experience. Visualize the problem as a question about the relationship between physical processes and subjective experience. The same physical processes, the same wavelengths of light, the same retinal responses, the same neural firings produce different experiences in inverted people, red experience versus blue experience. And this suggests that experience is not determined by physical processes alone, that there is something additional, something that could vary even when physical processes are fixed. And this something is what philosophers call qualia, the intrinsic experiential qualities of mental states. The what, it is likeness, and the inverted spectrum problem shows, or claims to show, that qualia are real, are distinct from physical and functional properties, are private and subjective. One response to the inverted spectrum problem denies that spectrum inversion is possible, argues that colour experiences are tied to their functional roles, to how they affect behaviour and other mental states, and systematic inversion would require inverting all these connections, would require changing not just colour experiences, but all the associations and reactions and emotions connected to colours. And once all these changes are made, the supposedly inverted person no longer has genuinely inverted experiences, but has the same experiences in a different functional network. And genuine inversion, preserving all functional roles while changing only qualia, is impossible, is incoherent, and the thought experiment fails because it describes an impossible scenario. Another response accepts that spectrum inversion is possible, but argues that it does not threaten functionalism or physicalism, because if inversion is undetectable in principle, then it is not a real difference, not a difference that matters, and science is concerned with objective differences, with differences that make a difference to behaviour or physical processes, and subjective differences that have no objective manifestation are not the kind of things science needs to explain, are not part of the natural world that science investigates. And so the inverted spectrum problem, even if it shows that qualia are private, does not show that they are non-physical, only that they are aspects of physical states that science does not need to characterize in its theories. A third response appeals to the ecological theory of perception, argues that colour experiences are not arbitrary inner states, but are shaped by the environment, by what colours signify, by their natural and biological meanings. And red looks the way it does because of its associations with blood, fire, ripe fruit, danger, and these associations are grounded in evolutionary history, in universal human experiences, and systematic inversion would disrupt these associations, would make red look restful and blue look alarming, and this would be detectable, would affect behaviour, and so genuine spectrum inversion, preserving all functional roles, including emotional and associative roles, is impossible. The inverted spectrum problem also connects to the problem of other minds, because if spectrum inversion is possible, then we cannot know what other people experience, cannot know whether their red is our red or our blue. And this creates a kind of skepticism, a recognition that subjective experience is essentially private, is not fully accessible to others, and while we can know what people say about their experiences, what behaviours they exhibit, we cannot know what they actually feel, what their experiences are like from the inside. And this privacy is both troubling and profound, suggests that each person's consciousness is a private world, knowable fully only to themselves. Some philosophers argue that the inverted spectrum problem trades on confusion about the nature of colour experience, that colours are not simple intrinsic qualities, but are defined by their relationships to other colours, to contexts, to perceptual constancies, and that inverting these relationships is not coherent, not a genuine possibility, and that the thought experiment misleads us by treating colours as if they were simple atoms of experience that could be swapped without affecting anything else, when in fact colour experience is holistic, is embedded in networks of perception and cognition, and cannot be varied independently. Others embrace the inverted spectrum problem, argue that it reveals important truths about consciousness, that qualia are real, are private, are not reducible to functional or physical properties, and that any theory of consciousness must accommodate this, must allow for the possibility that physically and functionally identical beings could differ in their subjective experiences, and this supports property dualism, supports the view that phenomenal properties are additional to physical properties, are aspects of reality that physical science cannot capture. The two people stand before the tomato, both calling it red, and the question lingers, do they see the same thing? Do their experiences match? Or does one see what the other would call blue? And there is no way to tell, no test that reveals the truth, and the privacy of experience persists. The possibility that our inner worlds differ in ways we cannot communicate, in ways language cannot capture, and the inverted spectrum problem remains, not solved, not refuted, not accepted, but persistent as a challenge to theories of mind, as a thought experiment that probes the nature of subjective experience, as a question about whether qualia are private, whether consciousness has aspects that resist objective description, and whether the inner life of another person is truly accessible or forever hidden behind the veil of their behaviour and their words. And the tomato remains red, called red by both, but whether they see the same red, whether their experiences converge or diverge behind the labels, remains uncertain, remains one of the enduring mysteries about the nature of consciousness and the privacy of subjective experience. The infinite shadow paradox, when your shadow could cover the universe. Imagine standing in a bright room with a light source behind you, casting your shadow on the wall in front of you, and the shadow is roughly your size, perhaps slightly larger, depending on the distance between you and the light. And now imagine moving the light farther and farther away, keeping it directly behind you. And as the light moves back, your shadow grows larger, stretching taller and wider on the wall, because the light rays diverge more gradually, creating a bigger shadow. And if you continue this process, moving the light farther and farther away, your shadow continues to grow. And now the question emerges, what happens if the light source is infinitely far away? If the light comes from an infinite distance, does your shadow become infinitely large? Does it stretch across the entire wall, the entire room, the entire planet, the entire universe? And if so, what does this mean? How can your finite body cast an infinite shadow? And this is the infinite shadow paradox, a thought experiment that reveals tensions between geometry, infinity, and the behavior of light. Consider the geometry more carefully. When the light is close behind you, the light rays that graze the top of your head and the light rays that graze your feet diverge at a large angle, creating a shadow that is only slightly larger than your body. But as the light moves farther away, the angle between these rays decreases. The rays become more nearly parallel, and the shadow grows proportionally. And in the limiting case where the light is infinitely far away, the rays become perfectly parallel, and the shadow, if it still makes sense to talk about a shadow, is no longer a finite shape on a surface, but an infinite column of darkness extending forever in the direction away from the light. And your body blocks a certain solid angle of light, a cone of rays, and when the light is infinitely far away, this cone becomes a cylinder, extending infinitely. And so, in some sense, your shadow has become infinite. It covers an infinite region, of space. But there is something strange about this conclusion, because in reality, when light comes from very far away, like sunlight which travels from the sun 93 million miles distant, shadows are sharp and well-defined, not infinite. And the reason is that even though the sun is very far away, it is not infinitely far. And more importantly, the sun is not a point source. It is an extended object, a sphere, and light comes from every point on the sun's surface. And these different light sources create slightly different shadows that overlap. And the overlapping softens the edges and prevents the shadow from extending infinitely. And so the paradox relies on an idealization, a perfectly point-like light source at infinite distance. And this idealization does not correspond to physical reality. And so the infinite shadow is a feature of the idealized model rather than a genuine physical phenomenon. Another way to resolve the paradox is to recognize that the concept of a shadow depends on there being a surface on which the shadow is cast, a wall or a floor or the ground. And if the light is infinitely far away and there is no surface, then there is no shadow in the usual sense. There is a region of space from which light is blocked, but without a surface to project onto. The notion of shadow loses its meaning, and so the infinite shadow is not a shadow at all, but an abstract geometric construction, a cylinder of blocked light extending through space. And whether this deserves to be called a shadow or an infinitely large shadow is a matter of definition rather than a physical fact. The paradox also connects to questions about parallel lines and perspective, because in ordinary experience, parallel lines appear to converge at a vanishing point on the horizon. Train tracks appear to meet in the distance, even though they remain the same distance apart. And this convergence is a feature of perspective, of how our eyes or cameras project three-dimensional space onto two-dimensional images. But in the case of light rays coming from infinity, the rays are truly parallel, not merely appearing parallel, and parallel lines by definition never meet, extend forever without intersecting. And so the shadow, defined as the region blocked by your body from these parallel rays, is a cylinder that extends infinitely. And there is no convergence, no finite boundary. And the paradox is that this seems to make your small body relevant to arbitrarily distant regions of space, seems to give your finite physical presence infinite geometric reach. Some philosophers have used the infinite shadow paradox to argue about the nature of infinity and the limits of physical realizability, suggesting that infinite quantities like infinite distance or infinite extension cannot actually occur in the physical universe, that they are useful mathematical idealizations, but not genuine features of reality. And the paradox supports this view by showing that infinite idealizations lead to strange consequences that do not match experience. And so perhaps infinity is a tool for calculation rather than a description of the actual world. And the paradox is avoided by rejecting the premise that light can come from infinite distance, or that shadows can extend infinitely. Others embrace the paradox as revealing something genuine about geometry and light, accepting that in an idealized geometric setting, with a point source at infinity and parallel rays, shadows do become infinite. And this is not a contradiction, but a feature of how geometry works, and the fact that physical light sources are extended and finite distances are never truly infinite means that the paradox does not apply to real shadows, but it remains a valid thought experiment about what would happen in an idealized limit. And such thought experiments are valuable for understanding the structure of space and the behavior of light, even if they do not correspond to observable phenomena. Visualize yourself standing on an infinite flat plane, with a point of light infinitely far behind you, and the light rays come in perfectly parallel, and your body blocks a cylinder of these rays, and the cylinder extends forward forever. And if there were a wall anywhere in front of you, no matter how far away, your shadow would appear on that wall, and the shadow would be exactly your size, exactly your shape, because the parallel rays preserve size and shape. And so, in this sense, your shadow is not infinitely large, but infinitely long. It is a finite cross-section extended through infinite space. And whether this counts as an infinite shadow or merely an infinitely extended shadow is a question of terminology. But the strangeness remains, the fact that your finite body has infinite geometric influence. The paradox also appears in discussions of cosmology and the nature of the universe, because if the universe is infinite in spatial extent and light travels in straight lines, then in principle, a light source on one side of the universe could cast shadows of objects on the other side, and the time required for light to travel such distances would be infinite. And so the shadow would never actually form, would always be in the process of propagating, and this raises questions about whether infinite distances are meaningful, whether light travelling forever without reaching a destination is different from light that does not exist, and whether geometric constructions that invoke infinity are useful descriptions or merely mathematical artifacts. The shadow stretches forward, grows as the light recedes, and in the limit becomes infinite, a column of darkness extending without end, and you stand there, finite and small, casting a shadow that reaches to infinity. And the paradox asks whether this makes sense, whether infinite shadows are possible, whether geometry allows such things. And the answer depends on what idealizations are accepted, on whether point sources and infinite distances and perfect parallel rays are admitted. And if they are, then the shadow is infinite, and if they are not, then the paradox dissolves. And the paradox remains a teaching tool, an illustration of how infinity changes things, how limits can produce strange results, how geometric reasoning applied to idealized cases can lead to conclusions that violate intuition, and the shadow persists, stretching toward infinity, a monument to the strangeness of geometric idealizations and the care required when reasoning about the infinite. The knower paradox. There exists a peculiar sentence that seems to lead directly to contradiction, and this sentence states the knower is not known. And the question arises, is this sentence true or false? And both options lead to trouble, creating what is known as the knower paradox, a puzzle in epistemic logic that reveals tensions between knowledge, truth, and self-reference. Suppose the sentence "the knower is not known" is true. Then by definition of what the sentence says, the fact that the knower is not known is itself not known. It is a truth that escapes knowledge, but if this is a truth, then it is knowable. There is nothing incoherent about knowing that something is not known. We know many facts of the form. Nobody knows X. We know that nobody knows the exact number of grains of sand on all the Earth's beaches, and so if the knower is not known is true, then someone could know it. But if someone knows it, then they know that the knower is not known, which means the knower, the fact that the knower is not known, is now known. And this contradicts the content of the sentence, which states that this fact is not known. And so assuming the sentence is true leads to contradiction. Suppose instead that the sentence is false, then its negation is true, which means the knower is known, which means someone knows that the knower is not known. But if someone knows this, then the knower, the proposition that the knower is not known, is indeed not known becomes known. And so the sentence is true after all. And again, contradiction emerges. And so neither assuming the sentence is true, nor assuming it is false, leads to a consistent outcome, and the paradox resists resolution through ordinary logical means. The knower paradox is related to the liar paradox and other self-referential semantic paradoxes, but it involves knowledge rather than truth, and it shows that knowledge, like truth, cannot be fully captured within a single, consistent formal system without restrictions, that self-reference combined with epistemic notions generates instability, and the paradox has implications for epistemic logic, the formal study of knowledge and belief, because standard epistemic logics treat knowledge as a modality, a sentential operator that applies to propositions. And these logics typically assume that knowledge is factive. If you know P, then P is true, and that knowledge is transparent. if you know P, then you know that you know P. And these principles, which seem innocuous, interact with self-reference to produce paradoxes like the knower. One response to the knower paradox is to restrict self-reference, to prohibit sentences that refer to their own knowability status, much like Tarski's hierarchy of languages prohibits sentences that refer to their own truth. And on this approach, the knower is not known is not a genuine sentence, not a proposition with a truth value, but a piece of ill-formed language that violates the rules of proper semantic construction. And while this response avoids contradiction, it does so at the cost of limiting what can be said, of ruling out sentences that seem grammatically and conceptually well-formed. And it leaves open the question of why these restrictions should be imposed, whether they reflect genuine features of knowledge or are merely technical devices to preserve consistency. Another response distinguishes between levels of knowledge, perhaps first-order knowledge about the world, second-order knowledge about knowledge, third-order knowledge about knowledge of knowledge, and so on, and argues that the knower paradox conflates these levels, that the knower is not known involves a sentence referring to its own knowability at the same level, and that this is illegitimate, that knowledge statements must be stratified into a hierarchy where knowledge at one level can only apply to propositions at lower levels, and this hierarchical approach mirrors solutions to the liar paradox and other semantic paradoxes, but it raises questions about whether ordinary knowledge attributions respect such hierarchies, whether in natural language we freely mix levels of knowledge without contradiction, and whether imposing hierarchies is a genuine solution or merely a way of avoiding the problem. Some philosophers embrace paraconsistent logic, systems that allow contradictions to exist without trivializing the entire system, without forcing the conclusion that everything is true. And in paraconsistent frameworks, the knower paradox can be true and false simultaneously. The sentence can be both known and not known, and the contradiction is tolerated rather than resolved, contained within the logical system without spreading. And while this approach is radical, it has the advantage of taking the paradox at face value, of not dismissing it as ill-formed or illegitimate, but recognizing it as revealing something genuine about the limits of consistent reasoning about knowledge. The knower paradox also connects to issues about the closure of knowledge under known entailment. The principle that if you know P and you know that P entails Q, then you know Q, because this principle, combined with the factivity of knowledge and certain assumptions about self-knowledge, can be used to derive paradoxes, and some epistemologists have questioned whether closure should be unrestricted, whether there are cases where you know P and know that P entails Q but do not know Q, perhaps because Q is a complicated consequence that you have not worked out, or because Q involves self-referential or paradoxical content that resists knowledge. The paradox raises questions about the transparency of knowledge, the principle that if you know P then you know that you know P, because this principle, known as the KK principle, is controversial. Some argue that it is too strong, that there are cases where you know something without knowing that you know it, perhaps because you're not introspectively aware of your knowledge, or because the recognition of knowledge requires second-order reflection that you have not performed. And if the KK principle is rejected, then some versions of the knower paradox may be blocked because the reasoning depends on assumptions about what is knowable given what is known. The knower paradox sits alongside other epistemic paradoxes, the surprise examination paradox, Fitch's paradox, Moore's paradox, each revealing different tensions in our concepts of knowledge and belief, each challenging the assumption that these concepts can be fully formalized without residue, and together they suggest that knowledge is a more complex and less tractable notion than it appears, that self-reference and knowledge do not mix well, that there are limits to what can be known or consistently said about knowledge, and that the project of epistemic logic, while valuable, must navigate carefully around paradoxes that threaten its foundations. The sentence "the knower is not known" hangs in conceptual space, neither comfortably true nor comfortably false, a knot that logic cannot untie, a puzzle that resists the tools we use to solve puzzles, and it reminds us that language and thought contain traps, that self-reference is dangerous, that some sentences generate contradictions not because they are meaningless, but because they expose the limits of our logical systems, the boundaries where consistency breaks down and paradox takes over, and the knower paradox remains, a thorn in the side of epistemic logic, a challenge to anyone who claims to understand what knowledge is and how it operates. And the question persists: is the knower known or unknown? And the answer, whatever it is, leads to contradiction. And the paradox endures, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, a permanent fixture in the landscape of philosophical puzzles, a reminder that even knowledge itself, the concept at the heart of epistemology, contains mysteries that philosophy has not yet fathomed. The hedonistic paradox: why chasing happiness makes you miserable. Happiness is what everyone wants, pleasure and contentment and satisfaction, the good feelings that make life worth living, and hedonism is the philosophy that says pleasure is the highest good, that we should pursue happiness and avoid pain, that maximizing pleasant experiences is the rational goal of life. And this seems straightforward, seems like obvious common sense. Who would argue against seeking happiness? And yet a strange paradox emerges. The more directly you pursue happiness, the more it eludes you. The more you focus on your own pleasure, the less pleasure you actually experience. And this is the hedonistic paradox, also called the paradox of hedonism, first articulated clearly by philosopher Henry Sidgwick in the 19th century and echoed by thinkers from ancient Stoics to modern psychologists. The observation that happiness cannot be obtained by pursuing it directly, that it comes instead as a byproduct of other activities, of pursuing goals and relationships and meaningful projects that are not themselves about happiness. And the paradox reveals something deep about human psychology, about the nature of satisfaction, about how conscious desire and self-awareness can undermine the very experiences they seek. Imagine someone who decides to maximize their happiness, who reads books about pleasure, who measures their mood constantly, who makes decisions based purely on what will bring the most immediate satisfaction, choosing activities because they are supposed to be fun, spending time with people because those people are supposed to make them happy, eating foods because they are supposed to taste good. And this person is completely focused on their own hedonic state, monitoring their feelings, evaluating whether each moment is bringing sufficient pleasure. And paradoxically, this constant self-monitoring and evaluation interferes with enjoyment, prevents immersion, creates anxiety about whether happiness is being achieved. And the person finds that despite optimizing for pleasure, they feel less satisfied than when they were not trying so hard, when they were engaged in activities for their own sake, rather than as means to happiness. The paradox operates through several mechanisms. One is self-consciousness. When you're focused on your own experience, watching yourself to see if you're happy, you cannot be fully present in the moment, cannot lose yourself in an activity. And this divided attention, this standing outside yourself observing, prevents the flow states and deep engagement that actually produce lasting satisfaction. Like trying to fall asleep by focusing intently on falling asleep, the effort itself becomes an obstacle, creates tension that prevents the desired state. And the same applies to pleasure. The monitoring prevents the experience. Another mechanism is adaptation and expectation. When happiness becomes the explicit goal, expectations rise. And when expectations rise, satisfaction falls. Because satisfaction depends not just on absolute pleasure, but on the gap between expectation and reality. And someone who expects to be happy all the time, who demands high levels of pleasure, will be disappointed by ordinary experiences that might have been satisfying without the inflated expectations. And so the pursuit of happiness creates conditions that make happiness harder to achieve. A third mechanism involves meaning and purpose, because the activities that produce the deepest and most lasting satisfaction are often those pursued for reasons other than pleasure, work that feels meaningful, relationships built on genuine care rather than instrumental benefit, creative projects undertaken for their own sake, struggles and challenges that are difficult but worthwhile. And these activities produce satisfaction precisely because they are not aimed at happiness, because they involve commitment to something beyond the self. And when happiness becomes the goal, these activities lose their meaning, become merely instruments for feeling good, and the meaning drains away, and with it the satisfaction. Visualize a person at a party who is there solely to have a good time, who evaluates every conversation by whether it is making them happy, who moves from group to group seeking the optimal pleasure, and compare this to someone who is genuinely interested in the people they meet, who engages with conversations because the topics matter, who is fully present rather than constantly evaluating, and the second person, paradoxically, has a better time, experiences more pleasure, not because they were aiming for it, but because they were aiming at something else, at connection, at understanding, at engagement. The ancient Stoics recognized this paradox, argued that pursuing pleasure directly leads to disappointment and suffering, that the wise person should instead focus on virtue, on living according to nature, on accepting what happens with equanimity, and happiness emerges as a consequence of wisdom and virtue rather than as a direct goal. And the Stoics were hedonism's critics, argued that pleasure is too unreliable, too fleeting, too dependent on external circumstances to be a good foundation for life. And the hedonistic paradox supports this critique, shows that even on hedonism's own terms, even accepting that pleasure is what we ultimately want, the direct pursuit of pleasure is self-defeating. John Stuart Mill, himself a utilitarian who believed in maximizing happiness, acknowledged the paradox and distinguished between higher and lower pleasures, suggesting that the deepest satisfaction comes from intellectual and moral activities rather than from sensory gratification, and that a life spent chasing immediate sensory pleasure is less happy than a life devoted to knowledge, virtue, and meaningful relationships, even if the latter involves more difficulty and occasional pain. Modern psychology has confirmed the hedonistic paradox. Through empirical research, studies show that people who explicitly prioritize happiness report lower life satisfaction than those who prioritize other values like meaning, relationships, or personal growth, that people who pursue pleasure for its own sake experience more depression and anxiety, that flow states and peak experiences occur when people are absorbed in challenging activities, not when they are relaxing or seeking pleasure directly, and that the happiest societies are not those where people pursue individual happiness most intensely, but those where people are embedded in strong communities and engaged in collective projects that transcend individual pleasure. The paradox also appears in consumer culture, where advertising promises happiness through products, through purchases, through experiences designed to deliver pleasure. And people chase these promises, buying things they do not need, pursuing lifestyles marketed as paths to satisfaction, and finding that the purchases bring momentary pleasure followed by adaptation and renewed dissatisfaction. The hedonic treadmill, where each purchase raises expectations and the baseline returns to where it was, and the pursuit of happiness through consumption becomes a trap, a cycle that produces more desire than satisfaction, more anxiety than contentment. And the paradox reveals that happiness is not a commodity, cannot be bought or manufactured, cannot be achieved by optimizing choices, but emerges from patterns of life, from relationships and meaning and engagement with the world. Some philosophers have argued that the hedonistic paradox refutes hedonism entirely, shows that pleasure cannot be the ultimate good because it cannot be achieved by aiming at it, that any theory of value must accommodate the fact that some goods are essentially byproducts, cannot be attained through direct pursuit, and this points toward alternative theories like virtue ethics, where the goal is to develop character traits and live well, rather than to maximize pleasant experiences, or like existentialism, where the goal is authenticity and creating meaning rather than achieving happiness. Others argue that the paradox does not refute hedonism, but only shows that indirect strategies are required, that sophisticated hedonists should not focus on their own happiness, but should pursue other goals, knowing that these pursuits will produce happiness as a side effect. And this move preserves hedonism as a theory of value, while acknowledging the psychological reality that direct pursuit fails. The person sits alone, measuring their happiness on a scale from 1 to 10, recording their mood, planning activities to maximize pleasure, and the numbers are disappointing, the satisfaction elusive, and slowly the realization dawns that the pursuit itself is the problem, that happiness was never meant to be a target but a byproduct, that the good life is not found by seeking it but by living it, by engaging with the world, by caring about things beyond oneself, by accepting that some suffering is inevitable and some pleasures are fleeting, and that meaning is more important than happiness anyway. And the paradox resolves not by discovering a technique for achieving happiness, but by abandoning happiness as the goal, by recognizing that the best moments come unbidden, arrive when we are focused elsewhere, and that the life worth living is not the one that feels best moment to moment, but the one that matters, that connects, that contributes, and the hedonistic paradox remains, not as a puzzle to solve, but as a truth to accept, a reminder that we are not built for pure pleasure-seeking, that our psychology is more complex than simple hedonism allows, and that the path to satisfaction runs through meaning and connection and purpose, rather than through the direct pursuit of happiness itself. The ladder paradox: how moving objects shrink and fit where they shouldn't. A ladder 10 meters long rushes toward a garage that is only 8 meters deep. The garage has a front door and a back door, both initially open, and the ladder is traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light, fast enough that length contraction becomes important. And according to special relativity objects moving at high speed contract along their direction of motion, and an observer standing in the garage watching the ladder approach calculates that at 80% of light speed, the ladder contracts to 6 meters, shorter than the garage, and so the observer plans to trap the ladder inside by simultaneously closing both doors for a brief moment, catching the entire contracted ladder inside the 8-meter garage. And this seems straightforward. The moving ladder fits because it is contracted, but now consider the perspective of someone riding on the ladder. In their reference frame, the ladder is at rest and maintains its full 10-meter length, while the garage is moving toward them at 80% of light speed, and so the garage contracts to less than 5 meters deep, far too small to contain the 10-meter ladder, and the person on the ladder knows that the front of the ladder will exit the back door before the back of the ladder enters the front door, and trapping the ladder inside is impossible, and so the two observers disagree about whether the ladder fits inside the garage, whether both doors can be closed simultaneously with the ladder inside. And this is the ladder paradox, also called the barn pole paradox, a puzzle about how length contraction and simultaneity interact in special relativity. The resolution lies in understanding that simultaneity is relative, that events which are simultaneous in one reference frame are not simultaneous in another, and the garage observer sees both doors closing at the same time, trapping the ladder, but the ladder observer sees the doors closing at different times. The front door closes first, then the back door closes later, and in the ladder frame, the sequence of events is as follows. The front of the ladder, still 10 meters away from the back of the ladder, enters the contracted garage and immediately exits the back door. And only after the entire ladder has passed through the garage does the back door close, followed by the front door closing. And so in the ladder frame, the ladder never fits entirely inside the garage, It is always longer than the garage, but the doors are never closed simultaneously with the ladder inside, and this removes the contradiction. Both observers agree on the physical facts. They agree on when collisions occur, on whether the ladder gets scratched or damaged, but they disagree about which events are simultaneous, about the order in which certain events happen. And this disagreement is not a matter of illusion or observation delay, but a fundamental feature of space-time in special relativity. Imagine space-time diagrams for both perspectives. In the garage frame, the diagram shows the two doors as vertical lines fixed in position, and the ladder as a diagonal streak moving horizontally through space and vertically through time. And the ladder is shortened by length contraction. And there is a moment when the back of the ladder has entered the front door and the front of the ladder has not yet exited the back door. And at this moment, both doors can be closed simultaneously, trapping the contracted ladder. And in the ladder frame, the diagram shows the ladder as two vertical lines, the front and back of the ladder stationary, and the garage as a moving object, contracted along the direction of motion. And the two doors close at different times. First, the front door closes and then opens, allowing the front of the ladder to pass. And then the back door closes after the back of the ladder has already entered. And the doors are never simultaneously closed around the ladder, and both descriptions are correct. Both are consistent with the laws of physics, and the apparent contradiction arises only from expecting that simultaneous in one frame means simultaneous in all frames. And relativity denies this. Simultaneity is frame dependent. The paradox also highlights the role of signals and information, because if the closing of the doors is controlled by signals sent at the speed of light, then the relativity of simultaneity ensures that the signals arrive at different times in different frames, and the physical mechanism that closes the doors respects causality and relativity, and no contradiction arises. The doors can be set to close when the ladder is inside, as measured in the garage frame, and this same mechanism, viewed from the ladder frame, closes the doors at different times, and the ladder is never trapped because it never fits entirely inside. And both descriptions are correct and consistent. Some people find this resolution unsatisfying. It seems like the ladder either fits or does not fit. There should be an objective fact of the matter, but relativity says that fits inside is not an objective notion. When motion is involved, it depends on what simultaneity convention is used, on which reference frame is chosen, and different frames can disagree about spatial relationships without any frame being wrong. And this is one of the deepest lessons of relativity, that spatial and temporal relationships are frame dependent, that there is no absolute space or absolute time, and that what counts as simultaneous or as fitting inside depends on the observer's state of motion. The ladder paradox has practical analogues in particle physics, where particles travelling at relativistic speeds appear contracted in the laboratory frame. And this contraction affects how they interact with detectors, how they traverse magnetic fields, and how their collisions are modelled. And physicists routinely account for length contraction and time dilation in analysing experiments. And the paradoxical features of relativity are not mere thought experiments, but daily realities in accelerator laboratories. Visualise the ladder streaking toward the garage, its atoms compressed along the direction of motion. The electromagnetic forces between atoms adjusted by the motion, creating a physically shorter object in the garage frame, and the garage rushing toward the ladder in the ladder frame, compressed to a narrow slit, and the ladder threading through this slit without ever being contained. And both pictures are correct, both are consistent, and the paradox dissolves once simultaneity is properly understood, once it is accepted that different observers experience different orderings of spatially separated events, and the ladder paradox remains a teaching tool, an illustration of how length contraction and relativity of simultaneity work together, how apparent contradictions in relativity are resolved by careful analysis of reference frames, and how our intuitions about space and time trained on low-speed everyday experience, fail completely when speeds approach that of light, and the ladder passes through. Contracted or not, trapped or not, depending on who you ask, depending on what frame you occupy, and the paradox endures as a reminder that space and time are not what they seem. That motion affects not just how we measure things, but what length and simultaneity mean, and that Einstein's revolution was not just about equations, but about reconceiving the very fabric of reality. The homunculus problem, the little person inside who watches the brain. A neuroscientist explains vision by saying that light enters the eye, forms an image on the retina, signals travel through the optic nerve to the visual cortex, and there an image is formed, a representation of the external scene. And this explanation seems to explain something, seems to describe how vision works. But philosopher Daniel Dennett points out a fatal flaw. The explanation assumes that someone or something views the image in the visual cortex, reads the representation, sees what is represented, and this viewer is like a little person inside the head, a homunculus watching an internal screen. And now we need to explain how the homunculus sees, how it processes the image. And the same problem arises. We imagine the homunculus has its own eyes and brain, its own visual cortex with another image, and another homunculus inside the homunculus viewing that image. And the regress continues infinitely. Homunculi all the way down, each one requiring its own internal viewer. And nothing is actually explained. The mystery of perception is just pushed back one level, relocated from the person to the homunculus. And this is the homunculus problem, the fallacy of explaining mental processes by positing an internal agent that performs those processes. And the problem reveals that explanation requires mechanism, requires showing how processes work without assuming an intelligent agent that does them, requires decomposing tasks into simpler tasks that eventually reach mechanical operations that require no intelligence, no awareness, no homunculus. Imagine opening a person's skull and looking at the brain, and there you find a tiny theatre, a little stage where sensory information is displayed, sounds and sights and sensations. And sitting in the audience is a little person, the homunculus watching the show, perceiving the displays, making decisions, sending commands. And this little person is you, is the conscious self, the experiencer. And this picture is intuitively appealing, matches how consciousness feels like there is someone inside watching experience. But the picture is incoherent, because now we must explain how the homunculus perceives, how it watches the theatre. And if we say it has its own brain, its own sensory organs, then we need another homunculus inside the first one, and the regress is infinite, and nothing is explained. And the homunculus picture must be abandoned, must be replaced with explanations that do not posit internal observers, that explain perception and consciousness in terms of processes that are themselves mechanical, that do not presuppose the intelligence or awareness we are trying to explain. The homunculus problem arises repeatedly in theories of mind, in explanations of perception, cognition, action, and consciousness, because it is tempting to explain mental processes by saying that some part of the mind does something, recognizes patterns, interprets symbols, makes decisions, and implicitly we imagine this part as an intelligent agent, as a little homunculus with its own capacities. But this merely relocates the problem, does not solve it, and genuine explanation requires decomposing intelligent processes into non-intelligent mechanisms, showing how intelligence emerges from non-intelligent parts, how mind arises from matter that is not itself minded. Visualize the solution to the homunculus problem as building intelligence from the bottom up, starting with simple, mechanical processes that require no intelligence, reflexes, stimulus-response pairs, basic computations, and combining these processes into more complex systems, and these systems into still more complex systems. And through hierarchical organization, through layers of increasing complexity, intelligent behavior emerges without any layer requiring an internal intelligence, without any homunculus. And this is how cognitive science and neuroscience proceed. Explain perception, not as viewing internal images, but as processing information through stages, each stage performing simple transformations, and consciousness emerges from the whole process, from the organization of these transformations, not from any single component that views or experiences or decides. Dennett's solution to the homunculus problem involves discharging homunculi, replacing each intelligent homunculus with stupider homunculi, with less capable agents that perform smaller tasks, and replacing those with even stupider agents, until finally we reach agents so stupid they can be replaced by mechanical processes, by circuits, by neurons, and the entire system operates without any component that requires intelligence, and yet the system as a whole exhibits intelligence, exhibits mind. And this shows that intelligence is not a basic property that some things have, but an emergent property that arises from complex organization of simple parts. And minds are not mysterious entities, but are patterns of activity in brains, patterns that can be explained without remainder in terms of physical processes. The homunculus problem also appears in discussions of free will and agency, where we imagine a self, a decision maker, an agent inside who chooses what to do, and this self is another homunculus, is an unexplained explainer, a source of choice whose own choices are not explained. And genuine explanation of action requires showing how decisions arise from brain processes, how choices emerge from neural activity without positing an agent whose choices are uncaused or caused by nothing. And this requires abandoning the homunculus picture of self, replacing it with a distributed picture where the self is not a little person inside but is the whole system, is the pattern of activity across the brain, and agency emerges from this pattern. One response to the homunculus problem accepts it as showing that certain kinds of explanation are illegitimate, are pseudo-explanations that do not actually explain, and cognitive science must avoid homunculi, must explain processes mechanically, must show how mind arises from mindless matter, and this constraint shapes the development of theories forces, theories to be mechanistic, to specify algorithms, to avoid appeals to mysterious inner agents. Another response questions whether the homunculus is always fallacious, argues that sometimes positing subagents, components with limited intelligence, is a useful step in explanation, as long as these subagents are eventually explained themselves, as long as the regress terminates. And this is Dennett's discharge strategy: use homunculi temporarily as placeholders, as ways of structuring explanation, but always with the goal of replacing them with mechanical processes. And so homunculi are tools for thought, are scaffolding that is removed once the real explanation is built. A third response argues that the homunculus problem reveals limits of reductionist explanation, suggests that consciousness might resist explanation in mechanical terms, might require a different approach, and the persistent intuition that there is someone inside, an experiencer, a subject, might reflect something genuine about consciousness that cannot be captured by functional or mechanical accounts. And this response is sympathetic to dualism, to the view that consciousness is not reducible to physical processes, that the subjective character of experience is not explicable in terms of objective mechanisms. The homunculus problem also connects to debates about consciousness and the hard problem, because part of what makes consciousness seem mysterious, seem hard to explain, is the intuition that consciousness involves an experiencer, a subject who has experiences, and this experiencer is like a homunculus, is an unexplained element in explanations of consciousness. And if we try to explain consciousness by saying brain processes produce experiences for a subject, then we have not explained consciousness, but only relocated the mystery to the subject. And so explaining consciousness requires eliminating the homunculus, showing how subjective experience arises without presupposing a subject who has experiences, showing how there can be experiences without an experiencer, or how the experiencer is itself constituted by the experiences rather than being prior to them. The little person sits inside the brain, watching the neural theatre, and the philosopher points out the infinite regress, the explanatory failure, and the homunculus must be eliminated, must be replaced by mechanisms, by processes that are themselves mindless, but collectively produce mind. And the homunculus problem persists as a methodological constraint on cognitive science, a warning against pseudo-explanations, a requirement that theories genuinely explain rather than merely labeling or relocating mysteries. And the problem remains relevant, remains invoked whenever theories implicitly appeal to internal agents, to components with unexplained intelligence, to parts that do what needs explaining, and the homunculus is a perennial temptation, a fallacy that resurfaces in new forms, and vigilance is required to avoid it, to ensure that explanations of mind explain all the way down to mechanical processes, to neural activity, to physical causation, and the little person must vanish, must be dissolved into the processes that were supposed to serve it, and the brain emerges not as a theatre with an audience, but as a complex system of interacting components, none intelligent on its own, but collectively generating the intelligence we attribute to the person. And the homunculus problem endures as a permanent challenge to theories of mind, a reminder that genuine explanation requires mechanism, requires discharge of intelligence into non-intelligent processes, and the little person inside is a fiction, a conceptual error. An understanding mind requires abandoning this fiction, embracing the mechanistic view that minds are what brains do, and homunculi are explanatory dead ends that must be avoided. The information paradox. What happens to information? When it falls into a black hole. A black hole forms when a massive star collapses. Its gravity becomes so intense that nothing can escape, not even light, and the boundary beyond which escape is impossible is called the event horizon, a spherical surface surrounding the black hole, and anything that crosses this horizon is lost forever, pulled inexorably toward the central singularity where density becomes infinite and the known laws of physics break down. And this seems straightforward. Black holes consume matter and energy. They grow as they absorb material, and information about what fell in is destroyed, erased from the universe. But this simple picture creates a profound paradox, because quantum mechanics insists that information cannot be destroyed, that the universe preserves a complete record of its state, that if you know the present perfectly, you can in principle reconstruct the past. And this principle of information conservation is fundamental to quantum theory, underlies the mathematics of quantum mechanics. And if information can be destroyed in black holes, then quantum mechanics is wrong, or incomplete, or requires modification. And this clash between black hole physics and quantum mechanics is the information paradox, first articulated clearly by Stephen Hawking in the 1970s, and still not fully resolved despite decades of intense research. Imagine throwing a book into a black hole. The book contains information, words on pages encoding knowledge, and as the book falls toward the event horizon, it crosses that boundary and disappears. And an observer watching from outside can never retrieve the book, can never read its contents. The information seems lost, and if millions of books are thrown in, if stars and planets and entire galaxies are consumed, all that information vanishes and the black hole carries no record of what it ate. It is characterized completely by just three numbers: its mass, its electric charge, and its angular momentum, and everything else. All the details, all the structure, all the information about what fell in is gone. And this erasure of information violates quantum mechanics, violates unitarity, the principle that time evolution is reversible, that information is conserved, and so we face a dilemma: either quantum mechanics fails, or general relativity fails, or our understanding of black holes is incomplete. And all three options are troubling. All three challenge the foundations of modern physics. The paradox deepens when Hawking radiation is considered, because Hawking discovered in 1974 that black holes are not completely black. They emit thermal radiation. Due to quantum effects, near the event horizon, virtual particle pairs pop into existence just outside the horizon. One particle falls in and the other escapes, and this process causes the black hole to slowly evaporate, to lose mass over time, radiating energy into space, and eventually, after an immensely long time, the black hole evaporates completely, disappearing in a final burst of radiation. And the question arises, what happens to the information that fell in? Does it emerge in the Hawking radiation, encoded somehow in the particles that escape, or is it destroyed when the black hole evaporates? And Hawking initially argued that information is lost, that the radiation is purely thermal, completely random, carrying no information about what fell in. And this conclusion shocked the physics community, contradicted quantum mechanics, and triggered a debate that has lasted decades. Visualize the black hole evaporating, slowly shrinking as it radiates, and the radiation escaping as a stream of particles, photons, and other quanta. And these particles are hot, thermal, their properties determined by the black hole's temperature, and temperature is statistical, depends only on energy, not on the details of what produced the radiation. And so the Hawking radiation seems to carry no information about the book that fell in, about the stars that were consumed, about the specific configuration of matter that formed the black hole. And if the radiation carries no information, then when the black hole evaporates completely, when the last bit of mass is radiated away and the black hole vanishes, the information is gone, erased from the universe, and quantum mechanics is violated. And this is Hawking's original conclusion: information is lost. And this creates the paradox. Many physicists rejected this conclusion, argued that information must somehow be preserved, that the radiation must carry subtle correlations, quantum entanglements that encode the information in ways that are not obvious, that appear thermal locally but contain hidden structure globally. And this view, that information is preserved, requires that the Hawking radiation is not purely thermal but contains incredibly subtle quantum correlations that encode everything that fell in. And these correlations would be fantastically complex, impossible to detect in practice, but they must exist to preserve unitarity, to maintain consistency with quantum mechanics. And this led to proposals about how information might escape, perhaps through quantum corrections to Hawking's calculation, perhaps through the interior structure of black holes being more complex than classical general relativity suggests, perhaps through the holographic principle, which says that all information in a region of space can be encoded on its boundary. And so information that falls into a black hole is actually stored on the event horizon, not lost inside, and gradually released as the black hole evaporates. The debate between information loss and information preservation became one of the most important controversies in theoretical physics, with Hawking on one side arguing for loss, and most of the quantum mechanics community on the other arguing for preservation, and the stakes were high. If information is lost, then quantum mechanics needs revision. If information is preserved, then general relativity, or our understanding of black hole interiors, needs revision. And either way, fundamental physics faces a crisis. And the paradox drove research in string theory, quantum gravity, holography, and black hole thermodynamics. And gradually, a consensus emerged that information is probably preserved, that Hawking radiation is not purely thermal, but carries information in subtle quantum correlations, though the details of how this works remain contentious and incomplete. Hawking eventually conceded the argument, famously changed his mind in 2004, and admitted that information is probably preserved, though he did not provide a complete mechanism, and the information paradox remains partially resolved. The community believes information is preserved, but lacks a complete detailed understanding of how information encoded in matter that falls into a black hole is transferred to the Hawking radiation that comes out. And this question touches on the deepest issues in quantum gravity, on the unification of general relativity and quantum mechanics, on the nature of space-time at the Planck scale, and on the limits of what can be known about the interior of black holes. And the paradox endures as a driving force in theoretical physics, a puzzle that has inspired new ideas, new mathematics, new ways of thinking about space and time and information. The book falls across the horizon, its pages fluttering, its words disappearing, and the black hole absorbs it, grows slightly more massive, and eventually the black hole evaporates. Hawking radiation streaming out, particles escaping, and somewhere in that radiation, encoded in correlations too subtle to detect, the information about the book survives, preserved by the laws of quantum mechanics, hidden but not destroyed. And the paradox resolves, not by destroying information, but by recognizing that black holes are more subtle than they seem, that the event horizon is not a simple boundary, but a complex quantum surface, that the interior is not a simple void, but a region where space-time and quantum mechanics intertwine in ways we are only beginning to understand. And the information paradox remains, solved in principle, but not in detail, a monument to the challenge of reconciling quantum mechanics and gravity, and a reminder that black holes, mysterious and powerful, continue to teach us about the fundamental nature of reality, about the limits of our theories, and about the deep connections between information, entropy, and the structure of space-time. The hard problem of consciousness: why brain activity does not explain experience. A neuroscientist maps every neuron in the visual cortex, traces every connection, measures every firing pattern, understands completely the physical processes that occur when someone sees the color red, knows which wavelengths of light activate which photoreceptors, which signals travel along which pathways, which brain regions respond, and the scientist can predict with perfect accuracy when someone will report seeing red, can manipulate brain states to produce the experience, has complete knowledge of the physical mechanisms. And yet philosopher David Chalmers asks a question that this knowledge does not answer. Why is there something it is like to see red? Why does the physical processing produce a subjective experience, a quale, a feeling of redness that exists from the inside, from the first-person perspective? And this question is the hard problem of consciousness, the problem of explaining why and how physical processes give rise to subjective experience, to phenomenal consciousness, to the felt quality of mental states. And Chalmers distinguishes this from the easy problems, which are merely difficult scientific questions about how the brain processes information, how it integrates data, how it produces behavior. And while these easy problems are challenging, they are tractable, are problems science can solve through normal methods. But the hard problem is different, is a question of a different kind. Asks not how consciousness functions, but why it exists at all. Why there is subjective experience accompanying physical processes rather than those processes occurring without any inner experience, without anything it is like to undergo them. Imagine a zombie, a philosophical zombie, a creature that is physically identical to a human being, molecule for molecule, neuron for neuron, that behaves exactly like a human, says the same things, acts the same ways, but has no inner experience, no consciousness, is dark inside. And Chalmers argues that such a zombie is conceivable, is logically possible. And if zombies are possible, then consciousness is not reducible to physical processes, because the zombie has all the physical processes but lacks consciousness. And so consciousness must be something additional, something over and above the physical. And this is why the hard problem is hard, because it seems to require explaining how something non-physical, something subjective, emerges from something physical, something objective. And no amount of knowledge about brain function, about neural mechanisms, about information processing, seems to bridge this gap, seems to explain why there is something it is like, rather than nothing. Visualize the explanatory gap. On one side is all the physical information, all the facts about brain states and neural firing and chemical processes, and on the other side is subjective experience, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the taste of coffee, and the gap between these two sides seems unbridgeable. Seems like knowledge of one does not give knowledge of the other. And no matter how much we learn about brains, we do not seem to get closer to explaining why brains produce consciousness, why certain physical systems have inner lives, and this gap is what makes the hard problem hard. What makes consciousness seem mysterious? What makes it resist scientific explanation? The hard problem has generated multiple responses. Materialists who deny that there is a hard problem, who argue that consciousness is reducible to physical processes, that once we fully understand the brain, we will understand consciousness, that the appearance of a gap is due to our current ignorance, and dualists who accept the hard problem and argue that consciousness is non-physical, is a separate substance or property that exists alongside the physical, and Mysterians who accept the hard problem but argue that it is unsolvable, that human cognitive capacities are limited, that we may never understand how consciousness arises from physical processes because our minds are not equipped to grasp the answer. One materialist response appeals to functionalism, argues that consciousness is not a separate thing, but is identical to certain functional roles, certain patterns of information processing, and what it is like to see red is just the functional role that seeing red plays in the cognitive system, the way it affects memory and behavior and other mental states. And this functional role can be fully captured physically, can be explained in terms of brain processes, and so there is no explanatory gap, no hard problem, only a conceptual confusion that disappears once we realize that consciousness is function and function is physical. Another materialist response appeals to eliminativism, argues that our ordinary concepts of consciousness are confused, are based on folk psychology that science will replace. And when neuroscience matures, we will abandon talk of subjective experience, we'll recognize that what we called consciousness was really just neural processes misdescribed, and the hard problem will dissolve, because the phenomenon it concerns, subjective experience as we currently conceive it, does not exist, and this radical response rejects the starting point of the hard problem, rejects that there is anything subjective that needs explaining. Dualist responses accept that consciousness is irreducibly subjective, is not reducible to physical processes, and argue for property dualism, where consciousness is a non-physical property that physical systems can have, or substance dualism, where consciousness is a separate mental substance that interacts with the physical body. And these views face the interaction problem, the question of how non-physical consciousness can affect physical processes, how mental causation works, and dualists have proposed various answers, some appealing to fundamental psychophysical laws, others denying that consciousness has causal power, but none has achieved consensus. Mysterian responses associated with Colin McGinn accept that the hard problem is real, but argue that it is unsolvable by humans, that our cognitive architecture is not suited to understanding how consciousness arises from matter. Just as rats cannot understand quantum mechanics, humans cannot understand consciousness. And this is not a failure of science, but a limit of human cognition. And we should accept this limit, recognize that some questions are beyond us, and the hard problem is one of them. The hard problem also connects to the knowledge argument. To Mary, the colour scientist who knows all physical facts about colour but has never seen colour, and when she finally sees red for the first time, she learns something new, learns what red looks like, and this suggests that physical knowledge does not exhaust knowledge about consciousness, that there are facts about subjective experience that are not physical facts, and this supports the view that consciousness is not reducible to physical processes, that the hard problem is real. The neuroscientist continues mapping neurons, continues discovering mechanisms, and the scientific progress is real, is impressive, reveals extraordinary complexity in how brains process information. But the hard problem remains. The question of why this processing feels like anything, why there is an inner light, why we are not zombies, and Chalmers's challenge persists, unsolved, perhaps unsolvable, a permanent limit on scientific explanation, or perhaps a confusion that will dissolve with better understanding. And philosophers and scientists continue to debate, continue to propose theories, continue to argue about whether consciousness is physical or non-physical, reducible or irreducible, explicable or mysterious, and the hard problem endures as one of the central problems in philosophy of mind, a problem that touches on the nature of reality, on the relationship between mind and matter, on what we are and what it means to be conscious. And the problem remains hard, stubbornly resistant to solution, a gap that knowledge does not seem to close, an explanatory challenge that persists despite centuries of reflection and decades of neuroscience, and consciousness continues to feel mysterious, continues to seem like something that physics cannot capture. And the hard problem stands as a monument to this mystery, a permanent reminder that subjective experience, the felt quality of mental life, resists reduction to objective physical processes. And whether this resistance reflects a genuine metaphysical divide, or merely our current conceptual limitations, remains one of philosophy's deepest and most difficult questions. The is-ought problem, why facts cannot tell us what to do. Science describes the world, tells us what is, what exists, how things work, the laws of nature, the facts about atoms and organisms and stars, and these descriptions are supported by evidence, by observation and experiment, and they are objective, true or false, regardless of what anyone thinks or wants. And ethics prescribes action, tells us what ought to be, what we should do, what goals to pursue, how to treat others. And these prescriptions are normative, involve value and obligation. And the question that has haunted philosophy since David Hume raised it in 1739 is whether we can derive ought from is, whether we can move from factual premises to moral conclusions, whether what exists tells us anything about what should exist. And Hume's answer was no. There is a gap, an unbridgeable chasm between descriptions and prescriptions, between facts and values, between is and ought. And no amount of purely factual information can tell us what we should do. And this is the is-ought problem, sometimes called Hume's guillotine, because it cuts moral reasoning off from empirical inquiry, separates facts from values, and leaves us wondering how moral knowledge is possible if it cannot be derived from facts about the world. Hume observed that writers on morality begin with ordinary observations, with statements about human nature or God or social arrangements, statements that use the copula is, describing what exists, and then suddenly they switch to statements using ought or ought not, prescribing actions or condemning behaviours. And this transition, Hume says, is never explained, is never justified. The writers seem to assume that the ought follows from the is, that because things are a certain way we should act in a certain way, but this assumption is invalid. The ought does not follow. There is a logical gap, and any argument that moves from is to ought is either invalid or contains a hidden normative premise that was smuggled in. And if all moral arguments ultimately rest on normative premises that cannot be derived from facts, then moral reasoning is fundamentally different from empirical reasoning, is based on values or sentiments or intuitions that are not themselves factual claims. Visualize an argument that tries to derive ought from is. Suppose someone says humans are naturally cooperative. This is a factual claim about human psychology, and then concludes, therefore, we ought to cooperate, a normative claim about how we should behave. And Hume's challenge is to explain how the conclusion follows from the premise, what licenses the move from description to prescription, and the argument seems to assume that what is natural is good, that we should act in accordance with our nature. But this assumption is itself a normative claim, a hidden ought premise. And if we make it explicit, the argument becomes humans are naturally cooperative, and we ought to act according to our nature. Therefore, we ought to cooperate. And now the argument is valid, but it rests on a normative premise, the claim that we ought to act according to our nature. And this premise cannot be derived from facts about what human nature is. It is a value judgment, an ought claim, and so the original argument either was invalid or contained a hidden normative premise. And either way, the is-ought gap remains. The ought was not derived purely from is. The same problem arises for any attempt to ground morality in facts. If someone says actions that maximize happiness are good because happiness is what everyone wants, the argument moves from the facts that people desire happiness to the normative claim that happiness is good. And this move assumes that what people desire is good. Another hidden normative premise, or if someone says we should obey God's commands because God created us, the argument moves from the fact of creation to the obligation to obey. And this assumes that we ought to obey our Creator. Another normative premise. And in every case, the derivation fails unless a normative premise is included. And if normative premises cannot themselves be derived from facts, then the ultimate foundation of ethics is non-factual, is based on values or intuitions or conventions that are not grounded in empirical reality. The is-ought problem creates a dilemma for moral philosophy. Either accept that moral claims are not factual, are not true or false in the way scientific claims are, but express attitudes or prescribe actions or reflect cultural conventions, and this leads to non-cognitivism or relativism, views that deny objective moral truth, or accept that moral claims are factual, but insist that moral facts are sui generis, are not reducible to natural facts, are known through intuition or reason rather than through empirical observation, and this leads to non-naturalism, the view that morality is objective but not part of the natural world, studied by science, or find some way to bridge the is-ought gap, to derive ought from is, and this requires showing that certain facts entail normative conclusions, that the gap is not as wide as Hume thought. And various philosophers have attempted this, have proposed that the gap can be crossed under certain conditions. One attempt to bridge the gap involves institutional facts, facts about social practices and their constitutive rules. John Searle argued that if you accept a role within an institution, you accept the obligations that come with it. If you are a chess player, you ought to move the bishop diagonally, not because of an additional normative premise, but because that is what it means to be playing chess. The ought is built into the description of the institution, and similarly, if you make a promise, you create an obligation. You ought to keep the promise, and this ought follows from the fact of promising, from the institution of promising and its rules. And Searle claims this shows that ought can be derived from is, that institutional facts bridge the gap. But critics respond that this only works if you already accept the institution, already grant that you ought to follow its rules, and so the normative premise is still there, hidden in the acceptance of the institution. Another attempt involves functional facts. Facts about what things are for. Philippa Foot and others argue that living things have natural functions. Hearts are for pumping blood, eyes are for seeing, and organisms can be evaluated by how well they fulfill their functions. A good heart pumps blood efficiently, a defective heart does not. And humans have functions too, and virtues are traits that enable humans to flourish, to live well, and so we ought to develop virtues, and this ought to follows from facts about human nature and human flourishing. But critics respond that this assumes flourishing is good, assumes that we ought to pursue the goals set by our nature, and these assumptions are normative, are not themselves derived from facts about what human nature is, and so the gap remains. Visualize the gap as a chasm. On one side stand all the facts, all the truths about how the world is, what exists, how things behave, and on the other side stand all the norms, all the truths about what ought to be, what we should do, what goals are worth pursuing. And Hume's claim is that no bridge connects the two sides, that you cannot start with facts alone and reach the norms. That any path from one side to the other requires a leap, requires introducing a normative premise that is not itself factual, and this chasm separates science from ethics, separates empirical inquiry from moral philosophy, and raises the question of how we can have moral knowledge if morality is not grounded in facts. The is-ought problem has implications for moral realism, for the claim that moral truths exist objectively, because if moral truths cannot be derived from natural facts, then what are they? How do we know them? And moral realists divide into naturalists who deny the gap and claim that moral facts are natural facts, and non-naturalists who accept the gap and claim that moral facts are sui generis, are known through intuition or reason, and both positions face challenges. Naturalists must explain how to bridge the gap, must show how ought follows from is, and non-naturalists must explain how we perceive non-natural moral facts, how these facts relate to natural facts, and whether morality can play any causal or explanatory role if it is separate from nature. The problem also affects applied ethics, because if we cannot derive ought from is then scientific information alone cannot tell us what to do, cannot settle moral questions. A doctor knowing all the medical facts about a patient still needs normative principles to decide whether to continue treatment or allow death. An economist knowing all the facts about wealth distribution still needs values to decide whether inequality is unjust. And science can inform these decisions, can tell us the consequences of different actions, but it cannot by itself tell us what we ought to do, what outcomes we ought to pursue. And this means ethics is ineliminable, is not reducible to any empirical science, requires normative reflection and judgment that goes beyond factual knowledge. The chasm yawns, facts on one side, values on the other, and no bridge appears and Hume's guillotine falls. Severing is from ought, description from prescription, and the is-ought problem remains, unsolved, persistent, dividing metaethics into camps, challenging moral realism, questioning whether science can answer moral questions, and forcing recognition that normativity is distinct, that ought is not reducible to is, that values are not facts, or if they are facts, they are strange facts, facts that cannot be derived from ordinary empirical observations, and the problem endures as one of the central puzzles in philosophy, a reminder that ethics is autonomous, that moral reasoning requires more than empirical knowledge, and that the relationship between what is and what ought to be remains one of the deepest and most difficult questions we face. The knowledge argument, what the colour scientist learns when she leaves her room. A scientist named Mary spends her entire life in a black and white room, a room devoid of colour, where everything is shades of grey, and Mary is a brilliant neuroscientist who specialises in a colour vision, and she studies colour from this colourless room using black and white monitors and books, and she learns everything physical there is to know about colour, learns about wavelengths and photoreceptors and neural pathways, learns about opponent processing and colour constancy, knows exactly which brain states correspond to which colour experiences, can predict with perfect accuracy what someone will report when shown a coloured object, and Mary's knowledge of the physical facts about colour is complete, exhaustive, includes every fact that physics, chemistry and neuroscience can provide, and yet Mary has never seen colour, has never experienced red or blue or yellow. And then one day, Mary leaves the room, steps outside, and sees a ripe tomato for the first time, and she experiences red. And philosopher Frank Jackson asks, does Mary learn something new? Does she gain new knowledge when she sees red for the first time? And the intuition is yes. She learns what red looks like, learns what it is like to experience red. And this new knowledge is not physical knowledge, because she already had all physical knowledge. And so there are facts about consciousness, facts about subjective experience that are not physical facts. And physicalism is false. And this is the knowledge argument, also called the Mary argument, one of the most influential arguments against physicalism, a challenge to the view that the physical facts exhaust all facts. Imagine Mary's situation, surrounded by books and papers explaining colour in physical terms. She knows that red light has wavelengths around 700 nanometers, knows that it activates long wavelength cones in the retina, knows the neural pathways from retina to visual cortex, knows which patterns of neural firing correspond to red experiences, and she can answer any questioner about the physics and neuroscience of colour, can predict how people will react to colours, what they will say, how their brains will respond. And yet when she sees red for the first time, she says, "Aha, so that is what red looks like." And this reaction suggests she learned something, gained knowledge she did not have before. And since she already knew all physical facts, the new knowledge must be non-physical, must be knowledge of phenomenal facts, of what experiences are like. And these phenomenal facts are not reducible to physical facts, are additional to them, and so physicalism is incomplete, fails to capture everything about consciousness. The knowledge argument can be formulated as follows. Mary knows all physical facts about colour vision before leaving the room. When Mary leaves the room and sees red, she learns something new. Therefore, there are facts about colour vision that are not physical facts. And this conclusion supports property dualism, supports the view that conscious experiences have phenomenal properties that are not physical properties, that the subjective character of experience is something over and above the objective physical facts, and the argument challenges physicalist theories of mind, challenges the claim that neuroscience can give complete knowledge of consciousness, suggests that first-person subjective experience involves aspects that third-person objective science cannot capture. Visualize the two kinds of knowledge. On one side is Mary's complete physical knowledge, all the objective facts about colour, the facts that can be stated in scientific language, measured by instruments, predicted by theories. And on the other side is phenomenal knowledge, knowledge of what red looks like, knowledge that can only be acquired through experience, through having the experience oneself. And the knowledge argument says these two kinds of knowledge are distinct, that no amount of the first kind can yield the second kind, and this distinctness shows that phenomenal facts are not physical facts, that consciousness has properties that resist physical reduction. Physicalists have developed multiple responses to the knowledge argument. The ability hypothesis argues that what Mary gains when she leaves the room is not new factual knowledge, but new abilities. The ability to recognize red, to imagine red, to remember red. And abilities are not facts, are know-how rather than know that. And so Mary's gain does not show that there are non-physical facts, only that physical knowledge does not automatically confer all abilities. And this response distinguishes knowing facts from having abilities, treats phenomenal knowledge as a kind of skill rather than propositional knowledge. The acquaintance hypothesis argues similarly that Mary gains acquaintance with red, becomes directly related to the experience of red in a way she was not before. But this acquaintance is not knowledge of new facts, it is a new way of knowing old facts, a new mode of presentation of facts she already knew. And so the knowledge argument fails because what Mary gains is not new knowledge, but new acquaintance. An acquaintance with experiences is compatible with physicalism, does not show that there are non-physical facts. The old fact, new guise response argues that Mary learns no new fact but learns an old fact in a new way, learns about the physical property of experiencing red by having that experience, whereas before she only knew about it through descriptions and theories. And the same fact, the physical fact about red experiences, can be grasped in different ways, through theoretical knowledge or through direct experience, and Mary's situation involves gaining a new mode of access to old facts, not gaining access to new facts, and so the argument does not refute physicalism. Another response denies the key intuition, argues that Mary does not learn anything new when she leaves the room, that she already knew what red looks like from her complete physical knowledge. That complete physical knowledge includes phenomenal knowledge, and our intuition to the contrary is mistaken, is based on underestimating what complete physical knowledge would include. And if Mary truly knew everything physical about colour, then she would be able to deduce what red looks like, would already have phenomenal knowledge. And so the argument's premise is false. The knowledge argument also raises questions about the relationship between different kinds of knowledge, between theoretical and experiential knowledge, between objective and subjective perspectives, and whether these can be integrated, whether science can accommodate first-person phenomenal facts. And Jackson himself later rejected the knowledge argument, became a physicalist, argued that the knowledge Mary gains is not knowledge of new facts but is compatible with physicalism, though other philosophers continue to defend the argument, continue to insist that Mary's gain shows the incompleteness of physical accounts of consciousness. Mary sits in her black and white room, learning about colour, mastering every physical fact, and then she steps outside, and the world bursts into colour, and she sees red for the first time, and the tomato glows in the sunlight, and her reaction is wonder, is discovery, is the sense of learning something utterly new, and whether this reaction reveals that physicalism is false, that consciousness includes non-physical properties, or whether it merely shows that knowledge comes in different forms, different modes, remains disputed, remains one of the central debates in philosophy of mind, and the knowledge argument persists, powerful and controversial, a challenge to physicalist theories, a defense of the irreducibility of phenomenal consciousness, and a reminder that subjective experience, the what-it-is likeness of mental states, resists capture in purely objective physical terms, and Mary's story continues to be told, to be analysed, to be debated, and the question remains, did she learn something new, something that physical knowledge could not provide? And the answer determines whether consciousness can be fully explained by neuroscience, or whether phenomenal experience involves something more, something that transcends the physical. And the knowledge argument endures as a vivid illustration of the explanatory gap, the gap between physical facts and phenomenal facts, between brain and mind, between what we can know objectively and what we can only know by experience.